That's a total shocker. El Salvador is abolishing Bitcoin as an official currency, and they're even banning Bitcoin payments, at least when it comes to officially paying your taxes. That's no longer possible in El Salvador. Right now, we're seeing a massive attack on Bitcoin from the International Monetary Fund against Bitcoin in El Salvador. Let's take a look at what's really going on. I moved to El Salvador. Is Bitcoin now dead here in El Salvador? Or is there something much, much simpler behind it? The whole thing is just boiled over very, very much, and in the end, not much happens. I'm getting a ton of messages saying, oh, El Salvador, now Bitcoin is dead. The Bitcoin project has finally failed. And so many times it's been said that the Bitcoin project in El Salvador has failed and whatever. There's just so much misinformation out there, I gotta say. And today, it's really about getting straight to the point, taking a good look at the situation. What's changing now? What does it mean? Because one thing has to be clear. This is definitely a very, very critical piece of news we're getting here, that El Salvador is now even officially banning Bitcoin payments for taxes. So you can't pay your taxes in Bitcoin anymore in the land of freedom. But we need to start from the very beginning and figure out exactly what happened here. So the International Monetary Fund, which can just give loans to countries like this, basically blackmailed El Salvador. They said, okay, hey, you can get a loan from me, or you can get a loan from our organization. The loan is worth $3.3 billion, and you only get this loan if you make certain concessions. And now a lot of people are saying that Bukele has caved in. And he definitely is, because Bukele has often taken shots at the International Monetary Fund, boasting about being the coolest dictator in the world, which he might actually be. And he even shared memes and joked about the IMF. But now, he's probably caved in because reality has caught up with him, since this is still a third world country when you need the cash. And then certain admissions were made here, economic admissions, but also admissions regarding Bitcoin. We're going to take a look at those concessions shortly. But it is very important to emphasize here that, in the end, not much has happened here. The situation is exaggerated, with news claiming Bitcoin and El Salvador's project have failed. However, nothing changes for me. I can still use Bitcoin everywhere. Bitcoin was an official currency here, but its acceptance was always voluntary. Lena Seish, who moved from Germany to El Salvador, aptly described the situation. And you also have to know that Bitcoin was an official means of payment here, but it was never pushed through as an official means of payment here. The acceptance of Bitcoin was always voluntary. Lena Seish, who also lives here in El Salvador and moved from Germany, really nailed it. She writes here that the International Monetary Fund basically said, abolish the Bitcoin law, or else something will happen. Make the use of your already optional currency officially optional and shut down your app that nobody likes anyway. And then people are saying that El Salvador is being forced by the IMF to abolish the Bitcoin law. But in the end, as Lena Seish points out, nothing really changes because before the Bitcoin law, paying with Bitcoin was already pretty much optional here. And then people are saying that El Salvador is being forced by the IMF to abolish the Bitcoin law. But in the end, as Lena Seish makes clear here, nothing changes because before the Bitcoin law, Bitcoin payment was already optional. So there was an official text for the law, but it was more like a guideline because nobody was really being held at gunpoint saying, if you don't accept Bitcoin payments, you're going to jail. And I thought that was really great. So the official currency Bitcoin was actually more of a marketing tool, in my opinion, the way Bukele used it. Because when you say, for example, Bitcoin is legal tender, you get a much bigger marketing effect than if you just say, like in Argentina, you can use pretty much anything as a payment method. It says Bitcoin is legal tender, you get a much bigger marketing effect than if you just say, like in Argentina, you can pretty much use anything as a payment method. Here, it's just free trade, like in Argentina, where they say, you can pretty much use anything as a payment method. Here, it's just free trade. From a libertarian point of view, from the point of view of the Austrian school, it is even preferable, as it is now, that Bitcoin is no longer compulsorily used as a means of payment, but that it is voluntary and you can still pay for everything else with Bitcoin, just not taxes. And I think how many people, as a percentage, pay their taxes with Bitcoin here in El Salvador? If we break it down, it's actually only a small part. El Salvador should remove the Chivo wallet, a useless tool. Nobody used it as it caused problems. Now, it's unusable, but nobody used it. Similarly, Bitcoin being optional is not new. Thus, core facts remain unchanged. And now there's all this fuss about how you can't use the Chivo wallet anymore, but nobody was using it anyway. It's the same with the Bitcoin law. There's all this uproar about how Bitcoin is now just optional, but it was already optional before. So in the end, the core facts don't really change at all. Everything that changes here is basically the fact that you can't pay your taxes in Bitcoin anymore, but honestly, probably nobody was doing that anyway. The bottom line is that the core facts don't change at all. All that changes here is basically the fact that you can't pay your taxes in Bitcoin anymore, but honestly, probably nobody was doing that anyway. And what also changes is that we have a huge symbolic impact here, and that's really the key point and the most important thing thing about this, let's say, loan in this news that we have the symbolic effect like, yeah, El Salvador is backing down, Bukele is backing down. And we have to be clear about this. In 2021, it really has a bad taste to it. And it's not, let's say, a positive symbolic effect because it really gives off the impression that they're now bowing to the fiat slaves, to the fiat slave drivers from the IMF. I mean, it's nothing more than a slave bank that ultimately enslaves third world countries because they know exactly, hey, they're dependent on our money. To build up their infrastructure, they have to take our loans or accept our loans. And through that, we can basically force them to make economic cuts, especially regarding Bitcoin. And what also changes is that we have a huge symbolic impact here. And that's really the key point and the most important thing about this, let's say, loan in this news that we have the symbolic effect like, yeah, El Salvador is backing down, Bukele is backing down. And we have to be clear about this. In 2021, it really has a bad taste to it. And it's not, let's say, a positive symbolic effect because it really gives off the impression that they're now bowing to the fiat slaves, to the fiat slave drivers from the IMF. I mean, it's nothing more than a slave bank that ultimately enslaves third world countries because they know exactly, hey, they're dependent on our money. To build up their infrastructure, they have to take our loans or accept our loans. And through that, we can basically force them to make economic cuts, especially regarding Bitcoin. And in the end, it's nothing more than modern slavery. There are also many good contributions from Alex Gladskin, who sums up very well how countries are being massively blackmailed by the International Monetary Fund. And it is also understandable that the International Monetary Fund does not like Bitcoin, because the International Monetary Fund is simply based on fiat money. It's just a corrupt system. Got to be careful what you say here because officially, what they're doing isn't considered a crime, but unofficially, it's pretty questionable what the International Monetary Fund is up to. You really have to look at the facts. El Salvador, as I said, is a third world country, and Bukele and company need help here. They just need the cash. They have to get the country in better shape. But I totally get all the people who are hating on Bukele and venting their anger and stuff. I completely understand that. But you really have to put yourself in El Salvador's shoes. El Salvador was one of the most criminal countries when it comes to gang crime. She was just raving about it. I'm still in touch with the locals. Whenever I ask the locals, when we're sitting together somewhere in the evening, we always talk about the gang times, how people were systematically robbed of their money, how there really wasn't a normal state for over 30 years. It was basically a state of war. You couldn't go out on the street. I just met someone yesterday who said, wow, he only bought a car 2 years ago, he just got a boat, and he's starting a business now because before it just wasn't possible. The car would have been stolen right away. He wouldn't have been able to own the boat because he would have had to pay hefty tariffs or gang extortion fees. He couldn't do business anyway because he was constantly being extorted. And he was basically trapped in his house. He was basically in a prison, and now he can break out of that prison. And that's the kicker. Consider El Salvador's progress. Since Bukele took charge, the economy has been growing. That means we always look at all this stuff through our Western glasses. But we have to remember that in El Salvador, we have had a growing economy since Bukele came to power. We've eliminated gang violence, we have a thriving tourism industry, we're seeing rising foreign investments, and over $300 million in profits from Bitcoin investments, which could amount to about $3.3 billion in 5 to 6 years. Because Bukele is also going to keep buying 1 Bitcoin every day. That doesn't mean that Bitcoin or anything like that is going to be sold off. El Salvador is still one of the countries with the highest Bitcoin holdings. There are even memes saying that El Salvador could buy Guatemala now that they've made so many profits. In Germany, they sold Bitcoin. Sure, it's not good news, but I think it's being blown way out of proportion, way too hotly debated. And you really have to put this into the right context. When you look at things from Germany, the situation looks different than when you view the whole story from here in El Salvador. And I invite you all to come here to El Salvador. By the way, I'm here at Cuatro Amigos. You guys can also check down below. There's a code, and you can even get a discount when you come to Cuatro Amigos. Really cool location, but you should check it out in person and see for yourself whether you can pay with Bitcoin or not. For example, I live here in El Zonte almost on a Bitcoin standard. I've mentioned this several times. I can't pay for everything in Bitcoin here. If I wanted to, I could pay for everything in Bitcoin, but I'd have to take a few extra detours. And that just stresses me out too much. But I'd say at least 60 to 70% of the things I can pay for here in Bitcoin. My rent, my motorcycle, those are the main expenses. Fruit stands and trucks here don't accept Bitcoin. In the mountains, Bitcoin isn't accepted everywhere, but you can use it at big supermarkets and gas stations. Knowledge gaps are closing, and the country is on the rise. If you go deeper into the country, into the background, somewhere in the mountains where it's not so touristy, sure, you can't pay with Bitcoin everywhere. But you can really pay with Bitcoin without any issues at all in all the big supermarket chains, at the major gas stations, and so on, and it's getting better and better. There are still a lot of knowledge gaps, but that's definitely getting better, and you have to take into account that overall, this country is on the rise. El Salvador is an emerging country, unlike Germany, for example. The EU is a declining country, that is to say, a Titanic that is sinking. El Salvador is a rocket that's currently shooting up. And what a lot of people forget is, what if Bukele takes the $3.3 billion he just got and buys Bitcoin with it? A lot of people forget that too. I think he officially can't do that. But that would definitely be the ultimate plot twist. He's being blackmailed here, 2021, to basically accumulate even more Bitcoin and is giving the IMF the massive middle finger. I don't think that would happen, or if he did, it would only be with a small percentage, maybe 10% or something like that. But there are definitely some contractual obligations that say Bukele can't buy Bitcoin with that. But that would definitely be the ultimate move, like a total counterattack against the International Monetary Fund, which is pretty twisted. When El Salvador introduced Bitcoin as legal tender, people were upset because the acceptance of Bitcoin was technically mandatory, even though it was never enforced, as I mentioned before. Today, people are upset because El Salvador is officially making the acceptance of Bitcoin optional. That really doesn't make any sense. Today, people are upset because El Salvador is officially making the acceptance of Bitcoin optional. That really doesn't make any sense. That means whether you make it optional or whether you make it mandatory, there will always be haters. There will always be people who say, okay, that's not possible. And when you're a first mover like that, you always take the brunt of it because in the end, all the publicity is focused on you. And now we need to talk about the 4 restrictions that El Salvador has taken on with this deal. First off, fiscal policy. El Salvador needs to reduce its budget deficit and put its national debt on a sustainable path. By the way, I'm currently reading from Blocktrainer. They put together a cool article on this, so feel free to check it out. I'll drop a link for you down below. Then it says here, transparency and governance. The IMF is calling for increased reporting, anti-corruption measures, and reforms to strengthen governance. Third, financial sector stability. Banks need to increase their liquidity reserves to better cushion against risks. Fourth, digital assets. Bitcoin and related projects are being restricted. The use of Bitcoin in the private sector remains voluntary. That's really, really important. Voluntary use in the private sector. Government participation is being significantly reduced. The Chivo wallet is being discontinued, which is fine, so no one really needs a Saudi Chivo wallet anyway. Bitcoin can no longer be used to pay taxes. Nobody does it anyway, we've already been through it. And then it clearly states here, the clear message is that Bitcoin is largely banned in the public sector, and its role as a payment method is shrinking drastically. This is the statement from the Blocktrainer. I wouldn't say that its relevance as a means of payment is shrinking drastically here, because let's say the main method of payment acceptance here in El Salvador is in the private sector, and I don't think that anything will change there now. I will report, I will tell you very clearly whether I will no longer be able to pay for my bananas or whatever, or my rent or something like that with Bitcoin. But I can tell you right now, because I definitely know that the landlord I pay rent to is still accepting Bitcoin, and I also know for sure that the shops I always go to are still accepting Bitcoin because they're all Bitcoin enthusiasts. And even if they were to completely ban Bitcoin as a payment method here, they'd still accept it because these folks are just hardcore Bitcoiners. There are so many hardcore Bitcoiners here, and there's also a sort of underground Bitcoin trade happening. That means even if it were legally restricted, everything would still keep thriving here. At least, let's say unofficially, there would still be a black market because there are just so many Bitcoiners, and they all make deals in Bitcoin with each other. This means that even if this were restricted by law, everything would still continue to prosper here. At least, let's say unofficially, there will be a black market because there are just so many Bitcoiners, and they all make deals in Bitcoin with each other. You can buy real estate with Bitcoin. I was asked if you can buy a property here with Bitcoin. In El Salvador, Bitcoin eases property buying over traditional methods. And here in El Salvador, when you go to real estate agents, they even say that Bitcoin payment is preferred for properties because it can be really, really difficult to bring large sums of money from the US or Europe to El Salvador. But when you buy a property with Bitcoin, it's easy. Just sign the transaction once, and that's it. The property gets swapped over. I also have a statement from Chris Meinhardt, who, by the way, also moved from Germany to El Salvador. So the question is, if El Salvador is really such a bad country, why are so many Germans or so many international people moving here? People are coming from Canada, the US, everywhere, escaping those socialist holes and coming to El Salvador. Apparently, something here can't be that bad. He definitely says that the El Salvador experts seem to be increasingly active on X in the last few days. I love it. The dictatorship in El Salvador is real. Bukele is a dictator. El Salvador has lost. Why? What a circus. The show must go on. And that's exactly how it is. So it's all a circus. We're definitely not in a dictatorship here. Here, people always accuse that it's a dictatorship. I don't know, I definitely feel freer here than in Europe and in Germany. I don't know where the supposed dictatorship is, but feel free to come here and see for yourselves if the military is marching around dictating what you should and shouldn't do every day. It's all way more laid back. There's way less bureaucracy. This is really Astromaniana, like pure pura vida. Even if, for example, So if you make some contracts with people, they sometimes don't even want that. I rented a scooter here, and they didn't even want me to sign anything. They took the Bitcoin, handed me the scooter, said, "We trust you. Ride the scooter and bring it back later." They took the Bitcoin, handed me the scooter, said, "We trust you. Ride the scooter and bring it back later." It's all more straightforward. There wasn't a contract. Everything is more straightforward here. If you want solutions, you can find them because people are solution-oriented. Things are different than the media portrays. If you want solutions, you will find them because people are solution-oriented. Sure, there are downsides too, and you can't overlook those, but things are really different here than what the media portrays. Check this out, it's really interesting. Here I am in a picture with a criminal gangster from El Salvador who's completely covered in tattoos. No, of course I'm not, that's German here. His name is actually German, which is a really strange name if you're coming from Germany. But here you can see that in El Salvador, not everyone who's completely covered in tattoos is locked up in prison. There were rumors that Bukele just throws anyone with tattoos in jail as a precaution because he's locking up all the gang criminals here, just on suspicion. And there are so many people who are basically innocent in prison. I'm sure there are definitely people who are innocent in prison. You also hear every now and then that there are stories here about people who may not be guilty and that they are trying to get them out. But it's definitely not the case that they're just locking everyone up in a dictatorship-style way. There are so many cases, like this one, of people who are fully tattooed and not in prison. And German is really one of the coolest guys you could ever imagine. I also asked him if he's afraid of Bukele, like if he thinks he might get locked up. He said very clearly, no, he is not afraid. He would also be officially checked here because they obviously saw the tattoos. So he was basically on the wanted list. They checked everything, looked into his background, and quickly found out that he wasn't involved in any criminal activities, so they just dropped everything. He didn't have any problems or anything like that, and he's actually a big supporter of Bukele. Of course, you have to look at it critically. I wouldn't bet my life on Bukele, because he's a politician, he's corruptible, he can be blackmailed, there are so many possibilities. But I can definitely say that I'm happier here in El Salvador than in Germany right now. Let me give you all a heads up again. Don't trust, verify. Really check it out for yourself. See what the situation is like here on the ground. Is this a dictatorship? Can you not pay with Bitcoin anywhere, or is it all just a bunch of hot air? Come here, check it out for yourselves, and don't let the media mess with your head or confuse you. I'm going to drop a link below for Bitcoin, the easiest way to buy Bitcoin in Europe. It's super simple. If you use the code Bitcoin Hotel, you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. Absolutely recommend it, even if you're a beginner. Here you can set up savings plans. Here you can set up auto transfers to the wallet. There are many cool, great features, and the whole thing is really easy. Let me know what you think about the whole topic. Until then, peace out.